Flavius Aetius, the forgotten savior of Rome. History remembers the barbarians who brought Rome to its knees, but largely forgets the last great Roman who staved off the inevitable. In the twilight of antiquity, as the Western Empire crumbled from within, a singular Roman general, raised among the very barbarians who threatened to devour the civilization he served, orchestrated what may be the most consequential, forgotten victory in Western history. Flavius Aetius, the man who had once broken bread in the tents of Attila himself, would later face his childhood companion across the blood-soaked Catalaunian Plains in a battle that determined whether Europe's future would be Roman or Hun. Flavius Aetius, a boy among barbarians. The villa outside Durostorum, where Flavius Aetius was born in 391 AD, stood as a testament to Rome's fading glory on the Danube frontier. His father, Flavius Gaudentius, embodied the complexity of this borderland, a Roman cavalry officer of Scythian descent who had climbed the ranks to become master of horse under Theodosius I. The elder Flavius understood something most Romans in their marble-clad palaces did not. The empire's fate would be decided not by philosophers in togas, but by men who could bridge the divide between Roman tradition and barbarian reality. Young Aetius's education began conventionally with Homer and Virgil, but everything changed in 405 AD when his father made the decision that would forge his son into the man the dying empire desperately needed. The air was crisp on the autumn morning when Gaudentius brought his 14-year-old son to the imperial outpost where Gothic emissaries awaited. "You are being honored," he assured Aetius with a forced smile that didn't reach his eyes. The boy understood what wasn't being said. He was being sent as a hostage to the Visigoths under their king, Alaric. As the delegation departed, Gaudentius pressed a dagger into his son's palm. "Keep this hidden," he whispered, "but remember, you go not as a captive but as Rome's eyes and ears. Learn everything." The Gothic encampment struck the young Roman as chaotic at first, a sprawling sea of tents and warriors that seemed to follow no rational order. The smell of wood smoke, horses, and unfamiliar spiced meats replaced the familiar scents of incense and olive oil. When a Gothic boy barely older than himself snatched away his writing tablet, Aetius responded not with fear, but with a swift strike that bloodied the other boy's nose. That night, he was summoned to dine at Alaric's own table, where the king laughed approvingly at the tale. "This little Roman has teeth," Alaric declared. The 3 years Aetius spent among the Visigoths transformed him from a sheltered noble youth into something unprecedented, a Roman who could think like a barbarian. He learned to ride bareback in the Gothic manner, to throw spears from horseback, and to navigate by stars when maps failed. Most importantly, he absorbed the unwritten codes of Gothic honor and kinship, observing how their leaders maintained authority, not through bureaucratic titles, but through demonstrated courage and generosity to their followers. Each night, before sleep, he would whisper to himself the names of Roman emperors, determined that his immersion in Gothic culture would not erase his ultimate loyalty. By the time imperial envoys arrived to transfer young Aetius to new masters, the even more fearsome Huns, he had become something unique in the Roman world. At 17, he spoke fluent Gothic, could debate tribal law, and had earned battle scars alongside warriors who respected him, despite his Roman blood. As he prepared to depart, Alaric presented him with a finely crafted sword of Germanic design, but Roman as inspiration. "You may need to use this against my people someday," the king told him with unexpected frankness. "When that day comes, fight with honor and remember what you learned here." Neither could have known that these lessons would one day help Aetius save what remained of the Western Empire from the greatest threat it had ever faced. Hostage to the Huns, Aetius' journey into Scythia. The caravan carrying Aetius crossed the Danube in early spring of 408 AD, leaving behind the familiar world of fixed settlements and entering the vast grasslands the Romans called Scythia. The imperial escort departed with evident relief, leaving the 17-year-old to continue forward accompanied by Hun warriors whose impassive faces betrayed nothing of what awaited him. The first Hun encampment they reached shattered any lingering notions about barbarian uniformity. Unlike the semi-permanent Gothic settlements, the Hun camp consisted of felt-covered yurts that could be dismantled within hours. Children as young as 3 rode small horses with the confidence of born cavalrymen, while women with intricate tattoos and deliberately deformed skulls, the Hun mark of nobility, stared openly at the Roman youth. King Rugula's greeting was blunt. "So you are the Roman whelp. They say you survived the Goths without becoming soft. We shall see if you survive the Huns without becoming broken." Unlike Alaric's political sophistication, Rugula, uncle and predecessor to Attila, embodied raw martial power. His scarred face bore testament to decades of combat, and the skull of a defeated enemy served as his drinking cup. That first night, served a portion of fermented mare's milk and raw meat, Aetius forced himself to consume both without hesitation, earning a grunt of acknowledgement from the king. Among the Hun warriors was a brooding, intelligent youth, several years younger than Aetius, Attila, nephew to King Rugula. Their first direct interaction came after Aetius had finally succeeded in striking a moving target from horseback. While other warriors reluctantly acknowledged the achievement, Attila approached with unexpected directness. "You learn our ways to use against us someday." It wasn't a question. Aetius, exhausted and sore, responded with equal frankness. "And you study me to learn Roman weaknesses." The response produced something rare, a genuine smile from the future scourge of Europe. "Then we understand each other," Attila concluded, and from that day forward, an uneasy respect developed between the two young men, whose destinies would later collide with world-altering consequences. The education Aetius received went far beyond archery. He learned their distinctive approach to mounted warfare, the feigned retreats that lured enemies into devastating ambushes, the emphasis on mobility over armor, the psychological warfare of creating panic through seemingly supernatural coordination of mounted archers. During one grueling training exercise, when Aetius suggested a Roman tactical adjustment, the Hun warrior trainer struck him hard enough to loosen teeth. "Think like a Hun, or die like a Roman," the man growled. That night, nursing his swollen jaw, Aetius made a pivotal decision. He would indeed think like a Hun, not to become one, but to understand the force that might one day threaten Rome itself. By 411 AD, when imperial envoys finally arrived to negotiate his release, they found not the broken youth they expected, but a hardened young man who moved and spoke with the confidence of someone between worlds. As part of the agreement for his return, Aetius helped broker a military alliance that would provide Hun mercenaries to the Western Empire, a double-edged arrangement that would later both establish his power and nearly doom Rome. Before departing, he sought out Attila one final time. Their parting conversation was brief but prophetic. "When you rule the Huns," Aetius said, acknowledging what seemed inevitable, "remember we once shared the same fire." Attila's reply contained both respect and warning. "When that day comes, either ride with us or stay far from our path." Neither could have imagined that 4 decades later, they would face each other across the bloodiest battlefield of the age, with the future of Europe hanging in the balance. The transformation of Rome and Aetius in a crumbling empire. Rome in 412 AD bore little resemblance to the eternal city of legend. 2 years after Alaric's Goths had breached the walls, the first foreign army to do so in 8 centuries, the psychological wounds ran deeper than the physical damage. The 21-year-old Aetius, who returned to imperial service, was physically transformed. Leaner, harder, his skin weathered by steppe winds, his Roman accent now tinged with Hunnic inflections. But the more profound transformation lay invisible beneath the surface. Aetius had developed a clarity about Rome's precarious position that few within the marble halls of power possessed. His first audience with Emperor Honorius revealed everything wrong with the Western Empire's leadership. The emperor, timid, indecisive, and more concerned with his prized chickens than statecraft, received the returning hostage in a chamber dripping with guilt ostentation. "They say you've become half barbarian yourself," Honorius remarked with nervous laughter, eyeing Aetius's scarred hands. "I've become whatever Rome requires to survive, Caesar," came the measured reply. Present at this first meeting was Flavius Constantius, the rising general who effectively ran the military while Honorius tended to his poultry. Constantius alone seemed to grasp the value of what stood before them, a Roman who understood their enemies from the inside. The Gallic frontier in 414 AD represented the empire's slow-motion collapse in microcosm. Assigned to reinforce the Rhine defenses, Aetius found demoralized garrisons, corrupt supply officers, and local populations more willing to negotiate with Germanic tribes than trust imperial protection. Rather than punishing deserters with traditional Roman brutality, he offered amnesty in exchange for intelligence about local Germanic settlements. When a supply officer was caught selling rations, Aetius forced him to personally distribute food to starving border villages. These unorthodox methods raised eyebrows among traditionalists, but delivered results that couldn't be ignored. As Aetius's military successes accumulated, so did political enemies in Ravenna, where the imperial court had relocated for safety. Most dangerous was his rivalry with Felix, an ambitious general with close ties to Galla Placidia, the emperor's influential half-sister. The sabotage culminated in 418 AD when Aetius was recalled to Ravenna to answer charges of excessive familiarity with enemy peoples, a thinly veiled accusation of treason. Rather than defending against the charges directly, he turned the proceedings into an indictment of the court's failure to understand the transformed world beyond Rome's walls. "I speak the enemy's tongue because I must know his thoughts to anticipate his actions," he declared. "I adopt his tactics because they are effective. I negotiate with him because our legions are shadows of their former strength. Should I pretend otherwise and lose more Roman lives to preserve the comforting illusions of men who have never set foot on a battlefield?" By 421 AD, Aetius had established himself as the empire's most effective frontier commander, but the sudden death of his patron Constantius created a dangerous power vacuum. When Emperor Honorius made the catastrophic decision to reduce payments to federated Gothic troops, Aetius proposed a solution that horrified traditional Romans but demonstrated his pragmatic grasp of the new reality. Recruit Hun mercenaries, the only force the Goths truly feared. The decision to bring 5,000 Hun cavalry into imperial service marked a crucial turning point, both for the empire and for Aetius personally. The sight of Hun arrows darkening the sky above Gothic positions represented both salvation and profound risk for Rome. They had gained a temporary reprieve at the cost of introducing an even more dangerous element into the imperial equation. The gamble had worked, but at what future cost? Only time would tell if Aetius's deep understanding of barbarian psychology would save the empire or accelerate its collapse. The fall of Western Rome, Aetius, and the decline of empire. The imperial palace in Ravenna, with its mosaic-lined halls and ceremonial grandeur, projected an illusion of eternal power that fooled only those who never ventured beyond its walls. By 430 AD, as Aetius consolidated his position as Magister Militum, the Western Roman Empire effectively ended at the palace gates. In Hispania, Vandals and Suevi carved up provinces that had been Roman for 5 centuries. In Britain, the last legions had withdrawn. In North Africa, Rome's vital granary, the Vandal king Gaiseric prepared a devastating invasion. And in Ravenna itself, an 11-year-old emperor, Valentinian III, played with courtiers, while his mother Galla Placidia struggled to maintain the fiction of imperial authority against the reality of Aetius's growing power. The relationship between Aetius and the imperial regent was a masterpiece of mutual manipulation. Through separate, contradictory communications, he convinced both Boniface, the commander in Africa, and the imperial court that the other plotted treason. The resulting conflict weakened both Boniface and imperial authority in Africa, with catastrophic results. Boniface, believing himself in danger, invited Vandal forces from Spain as allies. These allies quickly became conquerors, and within months, Rome's African breadbasket lay in Vandal hands. The loss of Africa exposed the hollowness of imperial power and the danger of Aetius's unchecked ambition. Yet paradoxically, the disaster strengthened his position. As food shortages struck Italy and panic spread, the court had no choice but to rely even more heavily on the one man who could still deliver military victories. Temporarily outmaneuvered after a defeat by Boniface near Rimini in 432 AD, Aetius retreated to his most reliable base of power, his Hun connections. Crossing the Alps with a small escort, he rode eastward to the camp of his old acquaintance, now King Ruga of the Huns. The deal Aetius struck revealed both his desperation and foresight. In exchange for Hun military support, he promised territory in Pannonia and annual tribute payments once he regained power. When Aetius recrossed the Alps in 433 AD, he brought with him a Hun force sufficient to terrorize the imperial court into submission. Galla Placidia, recognizing the futility of resistance, publicly reconciled with the general and restored him to his position as Magister Militum. The 11-year-old emperor, during the ceremony confirming these arrangements, was reported to have whispered to a chamberlain, "Is he our servant or our master?" By 446 AD, he arranged the betrothal of his son, Gaudentius, to Valentinian's daughter Placidia, a match that would have joined his bloodline to the imperial family and potentially positioned his descendants for the throne itself. For Valentinian, now 26 and increasingly resentful of his general's dominance, the betrothal symbolized a final humiliation. As Aetius consolidated power through this web of political and military alliances, the seeds of his eventual destruction were already taking root in the emperor's growing resentment. The master strategist who had outmaneuvered so many enemies would find his greatest threat came not from barbarian armies, but from the very throne he had worked so ruthlessly to protect. The last Roman general, Aetius, and the Western Empire's final stand. The military headquarters Aetius established at Arelate in early 451 AD bore little resemblance to the grand command centers of Rome's Golden Age. Gone were the orderly rows of identical legionary tents and the standardized equipment. In their place stood a makeshift command structure that reflected the improvised nature of the Western Empire's last effective fighting force. Germanic foederati lounged beside grizzled Roman veterans. Alani cavalry, distinctive in their scale armor, watered horses alongside Frankish warriors with their long axes. The linguistic cacophony, Latin mingling with Gothic, Frankish, and a dozen other tongues, required a small army of interpreters just to transmit basic commands. Now in his 7th decade, his face weathered by countless campaigns, Aetius retained the straight-backed posture and calculating gaze that had intimidated enemies and allies alike for 30 years. The intelligence confronting this unlikely coalition defied conventional military calculation. Attila had united virtually every tribe beyond the Rhine under his banner. The Hun army moving westward numbered between 100,000 and 200,000 warriors. Most terrifying were accounts of the sophisticated siege engines accompanying this nomadic horde. Against this existential threat, Aetius could field perhaps 40,000 troops, and even this modest force existed only on parchment until his diplomatic efforts could transform theoretical alliances into actual military coordination. The strategic deliberations in Aetius's command tent revealed both the desperation of Rome's position and the unorthodox genius that had kept the general in power for 2 decades. When his Roman officers proposed traditional defensive tactics, fortifying cities, protecting supply lines, and awaiting reinforcements, Aetius dismissed the approach with characteristic bluntness. "The Huns will bypass your fortifications, cut your supply lines, and there are no reinforcements coming," he informed them. "We don't defeat Attila by fighting like Romans. We defeat him by fighting like Huns, but with one advantage: knowledge of the territory." His military preparations broke with centuries of Roman defensive doctrine. Rather than concentrating food supplies in fortified cities, he directed the dispersal of provisions across thousands of small caches in forests and caves. Recognizing the Hun dependence on forage for their horses, he organized the systematic burning of grasslands along their likely advance routes. Most controversially, he authorized the breaching of defensive walls around several minor settlements, explaining to outraged local officials, "Intact walls will only encourage Attila to destroy your city entirely. Breached walls suggest an already sacked town with nothing worth taking." The defense of Italy that Aetius organized in 452 AD demonstrated both the limitations of Roman military capability and his continued capacity for unconventional solutions. The famous meeting between Pope Leo XIII and Attila at the Mincio River likely represented the culmination of Aetius's behind-the-scenes diplomacy. His tragic end came unexpectedly in September 454 AD, when Emperor Valentinian III, consumed by paranoia and resentment, personally struck the first blow in his assassination. According to the historian Procopius, as Aetius fell beneath multiple wounds, a court bystander observed, "Emperor, you have cut off your right hand with your left." The assassination marked more than the death of a single man. It represented the effective end of competent military leadership in the Western Roman Empire. The rise of Attila. Contradictions of Hun power. The Hun royal encampment in 434 AD sprawled across the Hungarian plains like a nomadic city, its perimeter marked by mounted skulls of defeated enemies. At its center stood the wooden palace that King Ruga had commissioned in conscious imitation of Roman architecture, a structure that embodied the contradictions of Hun power. Nomadic warriors who scorned settled life while coveting its luxuries. Inside this palace, as Ruga's body burned on an elaborate funeral pyre outside, 2 nephews faced each other across a divide that would shape European history. Bleda, the elder brother, embodied traditional Hun values, direct, martial, focused on immediate plunder rather than long-term strategy. Attila, though 7 years younger, projected a calculating intelligence that unsettled Roman emissaries. Unlike most Hun leaders, he spoke fluent Gothic and passable Latin, having absorbed languages as readily as military tactics during his youth. Their joint kingship revealed complementary talents. Bleda excelled at maintaining internal cohesion among the notoriously fractious Hun tribes, while Attila focused on external relations, particularly with the wealthy Eastern Roman Empire. The hunting expedition near the Tisza River in 445 AD that resulted in Bleda's death would later be mythologized in both Hun oral tradition and Roman historical accounts. When several tribal leaders questioned the succession, their severed heads soon adorned poles around Attila's compound, a stark message about the new centralization of Hun power. Sole kingship transformed both Attila's governing approach and his relationship with Rome. He introduced a rudimentary administrative system staffed by enslaved Roman scribes, established fixed tribute requirements from subject peoples, and created the first standing army in Hun history, 10,000 warriors loyal directly to him rather than through tribal affiliations. The Eastern Empire's diplomatic response to this existential threat produced one of the most valuable historical records of Attila at the height of his power. Priscus, a Roman diplomat accompanying an embassy to the Hun royal compound in 449 AD, described a leader who defied Roman propaganda, depicting a bestial savage. His appearance was not impressive, but he carried himself with dignity. His manner was stern, his eyes piercing, yet moderation revealed itself in his movements, and his bearing showed he was not without civilization. Most revealing was Attila's deliberate simplicity amidst growing ostentation. While his nobility dined using looted Roman silverware and drinking from gold-encrusted skulls, Attila himself used wooden plates and cups. The strategic reorientation toward Western territories in 450–451 AD reflected both expansionist philosophy and practical assessment of vulnerability. The pretext arrived in the form of a ring and message from Honoria, sister of Emperor Valentinian III, supposedly offering marriage to escape an unwanted betrothal. The military machine Attila assembled represented the culmination of his organizational innovations. At its core rode 80,000 Hun cavalry armed with composite bows. Supporting this elite force came an estimated 120,000 subject warriors, Ostrogoths, Gepids, Rugians, Syrians, and other peoples incorporated into the Hun Confederation. Most revolutionary was the logistics train that accompanied this massive force. Supply wagons, siege engines, and mobile forges that allowed sustained campaigning far from traditional Hun territories. The Sword of Mars incident, where a shepherd supposedly discovered an ancient divine weapon and presented it to Attila, demonstrated his sophisticated use of religious propaganda to unify this diverse force. His declaration as Scourge of God, destined to punish Roman sins, resonated particularly with Germanic subjects harboring Christian apocalyptic beliefs, effectively co-opting Roman religious ideology against Rome itself. The Gathering Storm, Aetius, and the Threat of the Huns. Winter in Ravenna, 450 AD. The shallow lagoons surrounding the imperial capital had partially frozen, creating a ghostly landscape that mirrored the Western Empire's precarious condition. Inside the palace, Aetius stood before a large map table, his weathered hands tracing potential invasion routes from beyond the Rhine. The intelligence reports painted an alarming picture: unprecedented Hun activity along the frontier, massive horse herds being gathered on the Hungarian plain, and subject tribes receiving orders to prepare for a major campaign. Most disturbing were accounts describing a new religious fervor sweeping Hun territories, warriors ritually dedicating themselves to Attila, now styling himself as an instrument of divine judgment. The diplomatic offensive Aetius launched in early 451 AD represented the most ambitious coalition-building effort in Roman history. His first target was the Visigothic kingdom centered in Toulouse, whose king Theodoric Nash controlled the most substantial military force in Gaul. The initial Gothic response epitomized the diplomatic challenges Aetius faced. Why should we bleed for Rome when Rome has spent centuries attempting to undermine our sovereignty? The breakthrough came through Avitus, a Gallo-Roman aristocrat who had cultivated personal relationships with Gothic leadership. His personal appeal to Theodoric transcended political calculation. "I do not ask you to fight for Rome, but for your own children. I have seen the devastation Hun invasion brings. They target not armies but civilizations." Aetius's outreach to the Franks revealed how thoroughly he had internalized barbarian psychology. Rather than approaching their king Merovec with Roman diplomatic formality, he sent a gift of exceptional symbolic significance, a finely crafted sword reportedly carried by the general himself in previous campaigns. The gesture spoke the language of Germanic warrior culture more fluently than any verbal argument could have. Most remarkable was his unprecedented outreach to the Bagaudai, rural insurgents who had periodically rebelled against Roman authority in northern Gaul. His offer, formal recognition of their autonomy in exchange for military cooperation against the Huns, transformed a domestic security problem into a strategic asset. The coalition that gradually assembled represented the most diverse military alliance Europe had witnessed. Romans, Visigoths, Franks, Burgundians, Alans, Armoricans, Saxons, and even some Bagaudai rebels united against the common Hun threat. The intelligence war that unfolded illustrated the personal dimension of the Aetius-Attila confrontation. Both commanders had cultivated extensive spy networks, with merchants, diplomats, and tribal contacts providing continuous information flow. Attila deployed calculated terror, ensuring accounts of Hun atrocities spread to undermine coalition morale. Aetius countered with his own information campaign, circulating accounts of Eastern Roman successes against Hun forces and highlighting Attila's recent defeat in Armenia. As Hun forces crossed the Rhine in multiple columns, Aetius faced the classic defender's dilemma, attempting to cover multiple approach routes with insufficient forces. Rather than dispersing his coalition to defend individual cities, he maintained a central position near Orleans, allowing rapid response to developing Hun movements while forcing Attila to divide his attention between military objectives and securing his supply lines. The approach represented high-risk calculus. Some frontier communities would necessarily be sacrificed, but the coalition would maintain cohesion for the decisive engagement to come. By June 451 AD, the largest armies the West had seen in centuries converged on the Catalaunian Plains, where the future of Europe would be decided in a single day of blood and iron. The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains, a turning point in history. Dawn broke hesitantly over the Catalaunian Plains on June 20th, 451 AD, illuminating what would soon become one of history's most consequential battlefields. The summer mist hung low over the gently rolling terrain, momentarily obscuring the two massive armies now fully deployed across a front nearly 5 miles wide. As visibility improved, the scale of the confrontation became apparent. Over 100,000 warriors representing dozens of cultures and languages assembled in what would be late antiquity's largest and most decisive battle. From his position near the coalition center, Aetius conducted a final survey of the battlefield. A gradual slope running through the center created a natural ridge that provided crucial observation advantages. To the south, a small stream bordered by marshy ground limited cavalry maneuverability. Across the field, Attila conducted his own assessment from horseback, surrounded by a guard of elite Hun warriors distinctive in their iron-scale armor. His deployment revealed sophisticated tactical understanding. Hun cavalry formed the army's center and left wing, while Gepid and Ostrogothic infantry secured the right flank against the marshy terrain. The battle's opening phase centered on control of the central ridge, a topographical feature whose importance both commanders immediately recognized. What began as a skirmish between opposing vanguards rapidly escalated as both commanders fed reinforcements into the engagement. The struggle demonstrated how thoroughly warfare had evolved from the disciplined legion tactics of classical Rome. Hun-mounted archers circled just beyond pilum range, delivering accurate fire from composite bows powerful enough to penetrate Roman shields. Gepid warriors attacked with long, thrusting spears designed to disrupt tight infantry ranks, while Ostrogothic heavy infantry employed massive two-handed swords capable of cleaving through Roman shields. The battle's decisive moment came with the death of Theodoric, the Visigothic king. Rather than demoralizing the Gothic contingent, his fall transformed their disciplined advance into berserker fury. Under the leadership of his son Thorismund, the Goths launched a devastating charge that shattered the Hun left flank. Attila attempted to restore the situation through personal intervention, leading his elite bodyguard in a charge that initially penetrated Gothic lines before becoming surrounded. The Hun king fought his way back to his lines in what became legend as his narrowest escape from capture. As daylight faded across the blood-soaked plains, Aetius faced the campaign's most consequential decision: whether to press the advantage through night attack on the Hun wagon fortress or consolidate the day's gains. Rather than risk his coalition's cohesion in a dangerous night assault, he maintained encirclement while avoiding unnecessary casualties. By the third morning, Hun forces had begun withdrawal eastward in good order. When the Goths demanded permission to pursue and destroy the retreating Huns completely, Aetius denied them with characteristic political insight. "Today we fight as allies against Attila." Without Attila, what reason would Goths and Romans have to remain allies? The Battle of the Catalaunian Plains had witnessed Europe's historical fulcrum, the moment when classical antiquity definitively yielded to medieval Europe's formative phase. Modern archaeological investigations have confirmed the extraordinary scale of the conflict, uncovering mass graves containing thousands of warriors bearing wounds from diverse weapon types. Most poignantly, skeletal analysis has identified individuals from regions as distant as Central Asia, the Caucasus, Scandinavia, and North Africa, testament to how thoroughly this confrontation had drawn together diverse peoples from across the known world in a single day that would determine the future of Western civilization. Attila's tactical shift, the aftermath of the Catalaunian Plains. The victory at the Catalaunian Plains proved both momentous and fleeting. While Aetius had checked Attila's advance into Gaul, the Hun king remained a formidable threat with significant military capability. Rather than retreating to his territories to lick his wounds, Attila made a bold and unexpected move. He turned his remaining forces toward Italy itself. The maneuver demonstrated his tactical genius. With Aetius's multinational coalition dispersing back to their homelands and the Italian peninsula, virtually defenseless, Rome's heartland lay exposed to Hun invasion. In early 452 AD, Hun forces crossed the Alps with a devastating effect. Cities that had considered themselves safely distant from frontier troubles now faced nomadic destruction. Aquileia, after resisting for 3 months, was destroyed so thoroughly that later generations questioned whether it had ever existed. Milan and Pavia surrendered without resistance, their populations subjected to calculated humiliation. Attila reportedly forcing Milanese nobles to eat from troughs like animals, while his men dined from their silver. As refugees flooded into Ravenna with tales of Hun atrocities, Emperor Valentinian III publicly blamed Aetius for failing to deliver the total victory he had claimed at the Catalaunian Plains. The defense of Italy that Aetius organized demonstrated both the limitations of Roman military capability and his continued capacity for unconventional solutions. Unable to meet Attila in open battle on Italian soil, he adopted a strategy of defense in depth, using the peninsula's geography to channel Hun movements. While northern Italian cities fell to Hun siegecraft, these costly assaults depleted Attila's resources and slowed his advance. Simultaneously, Aetius employed diplomatic channels that few other Romans could have accessed, direct communication with Attila himself, drawing on their shared history to open negotiations. The famous meeting between Pope Leo the Maur and Attila at the Mincio River, often portrayed as a purely religious intervention that miraculously turned away the Hun invasion, likely represented the culmination of Aetius's behind-the-scenes diplomacy. Historical records suggest Aetius had prepared the ground through intermediaries who emphasized to Attila the practical reasons for withdrawal. Disease spreading among Hun forces unused to Italy's climate, Eastern Roman armies threatening Hun homelands, and the limited strategic value of further Italian conquest. The Pope's moral authority provided Attila a face-saving justification for a withdrawal that practical military and political factors had already made necessary. The final months of Aetius's life unfolded against a backdrop of deceptive tranquility. With Attila's withdrawal from Italy and subsequent death in early 453 AD, the immediate external threat had diminished. Yet this moment of triumph contained the seeds of his destruction. In the imperial palace at Ravenna on September 21, 454 AD, Aetius arrived for a routine financial meeting with Valentinian III. As the general presented tax collection figures from Gaul, the emperor suddenly accused him of treason. Before Aetius could respond, Valentinian drew his sword and struck the first blow himself, shouting that he would no longer be ruled by his own servant. Hidden guards joined the assault, ensuring that the empire's last great general had no chance at defense or escape. According to the historian Procopius, as Aetius fell beneath multiple wounds, a court bystander observed, "Emperor, you have cut off your right hand with your left." The emperor's own assassination 6 months later, reportedly by Germanic guardsmen loyal to Aetius, delivered a fitting coda to this tragic miscalculation. The Western Empire limped on for another 22 years before final collapse, but its effective defense had died on the palace floor with Aetius. In his eulogy for the fallen general, Renatus Frigeritus captured the historical significance of the loss. With Aetius fell the Western Empire, and it was never restored. Flavius Aetius, the last defender of Rome. History remembers the barbarians who brought Rome to its knees, Alaric, Gaiseric, Odoacer, but largely forgets the Roman who staved off the inevitable for a generation. Flavius Aetius's achievements seem almost impossible in retrospect. A Roman general who mastered barbarian warfare, a political survivor who rose from hostage to kingmaker, and a strategic genius who assembled the most diverse military coalition Europe had seen. His assassination in 454 AD marked not just the death of a remarkable individual, but the end of effective Roman military leadership in the West. The final collapse of Roman authority occurred with shocking speed after Aetius's death. The Vandals, no longer restrained by fear of his military reputation, sacked Rome itself in 455 AD. The Visigoths and Franks, freed from their personal loyalty to the general, began expanding their territories at imperial expense. By 476 AD, when Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, the act merely formalized a transformation that had begun in Valentinian's blood-soaked palace chamber. What remained was not the centralized Roman state Aetius had fought to preserve, but a patchwork of Germanic kingdoms built on foundations he had inadvertently helped create. Yet Aetius's influence extended far beyond Rome's fall. The multicultural force he assembled, Romans fighting alongside former enemies against common threats, became the template for medieval European armies. His pragmatic approach to power, emphasizing personal authority over institutional structure, anticipated the feudal relationships that would define the Middle Ages. Even his diplomatic innovation of using potential enemies to balance each other would become standard practice in European statecraft for centuries. In death, as in life, Aetius stood at the crossroads between Roman antiquity and the European future his victories had helped secure. Modern archaeological work has confirmed the scale of Aetius's achievements. Excavations at the Catalaunian Plains have uncovered mass graves containing warriors from across the known world, visual testament to how thoroughly his coalition united diverse peoples in a single decisive battle. The defensive fortifications he constructed along the Gallic frontier incorporated both Roman engineering and barbarian tactical insights, demonstrating his synthesis of multiple military traditions. Most tellingly, contemporary chronicles from both Roman and barbarian sources describe him with a respect bordering on awe, acknowledging that he alone seemed to understand the transformed world emerging from Rome's twilight. The final irony of Aetius's career lay in how thoroughly his methods transformed Rome itself. By saving the empire through barbarian means, tribal alliances, personal loyalty networks, and mobile warfare, he accelerated its evolution into something its founders would scarcely have recognized. The very skills that made him Rome's most effective defender, his cultural fluency, his ability to bridge worlds, ensured that what he preserved would be neither fully Roman nor traditionally barbarian, but something altogether new. In this, perhaps, lay his greatest legacy, not as the last Roman general, but as the first leader of a genuinely European army, pointing the way toward the continent's medieval future.